mostly because we are, in fact, broke. They say that what starts in America eventually lands up here. Could Elon Musk become the government's role model for the next 4 years? Rachel Reeves needs cash for defence, and she's got cuts to welfare spending in her sights. But how much is on the chopping block? We'll speak to the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting. Government's scrapping of NHS England may have sparked a second bonfire of the Quangos this week. Do the Conservatives want an extinguisher on standby? We'll hear from their Shadow Education Secretary, Laura Trott. And as the Prime Minister rallies the troops, metaphorically at least, around a ceasefire in Ukraine, we'll ask the former National Security Advisor, Lord Ricketts, what the much-discussed International Coalition of the Willing can actually achieve. Plus, with us throughout the show, former Labour Work and Pensions Secretary James Purnell, the former Liberal Democrat leader Joe Swinson, and the former Conservative leader Sir Ian Duncan Smith. Welcome to Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. This may be the week the Labour government goes back to the future. The Prime Minister declared that the operations of the National Health Service would once again be in the hands of elected politicians rather than professional hospital managers. That echoes the famous declaration by Narendra Bevan when he launched the NHS in 1948. If a maid dropped a bedpan in a hospital corridor in his hometown of Tredegar, the noise would reverberate around Whitehall. This morning, the Health Secretary's told newspapers that the abolition of NHS England is just the beginning of Minister's plans, to coin a phrase, to take back control from what he calls the bloated bureaucracy. And if that wasn't enough to be going on with, the Prime Minister's got his eye on the benefits paid to people who can't or won't work, in some ways channeling the spirit of Keir Hardie, the Labour Party's founder, after whom he was named. Hardie's maiden speech in the Commons was all about getting people into work. Back in 1893, he argued that the country should rely less on importing immigrants and put what he called loafers and criminals to work. Then as now, immigration, welfare, even overseas aid divide opinion in the Labour movement, including, we are led to believe, within today's cabinet. There's no risk to the government's majority, but with a crucial by-election and local elections just weeks away, grumbling on the backbenches is the last thing that Number 10 needs right now. Let's start this morning with the government. A little earlier, I spoke to the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting. Wes Streeting, yesterday my Sky News colleague Sam Coates didn't get an answer when he asked the Prime Minister what sort of deterrent would British peacekeeping troops actually be if they couldn't fire on the Russians. Is there an answer?
Yeah, I think the fact that we've not been in that kind of direct confrontation with Russia, there has been a line that has not been crossed since the foundation of NATO. And what we, I think, all want to see at this stage in this terrible conflict is a just and lasting peace that also guarantees the long-term security of the people of Ukraine, as well as their freedom, their democracy, their independence. And that's what the Prime Minister has been working relentlessly to achieve with international allies, trying to bridge some of the occasional gaps and differences of opinion we've seen emerge between some of our European counterparts and our American counterparts.
But in a sense, what is the point? Because Italians have said they're not sending troops. It'll mainly be the British and French. But as far as we know, our position is that we wouldn't ask our troops to fire on the Russians. Now, we know what Putin is like. If our people stand by, he's not basically going to be bothered about them, is he?
Well, I think it would be an extraordinary escalation for Russian troops to find themselves in conflict with British troops. And look, what Thursday is about, where the Prime Minister and the UK are convening military leaders from across allied countries, is about having a serious plan, a serious military strategy to secure a peace. And of course, there's a huge amount of effort that the Prime Minister is heavily involved in to negotiate the peace. So there are lots of moving parts at the moment.
But we're talking
it's
about...
moving incredibly quickly. And what the Prime Minister has tried to do at every stage is to make sure that we come up with a credible plan involving the Ukrainians that guarantees their peace and security, and Europe's at large, because our own security is intertwined with Ukraine's.
But you use the phrase extraordinary escalation. We're talking about somebody who appears to have no boundaries on what he is prepared to allow his troops to do. So my point is a very simple one. What is the point of talking about peacekeeping when actually, as far as we understand it, the position would be, and the rules of engagement would be, that our troops would not be allowed to engage in, if you like, any kind of hot war, any conflict with the Russians? Vladimir Putin is a kind of person for whom that is simply an invitation to waltz straight past our people.
Well, there are two dimensions to this. There's the peace and then there's keeping the peace. At the moment, the peace is still to be negotiated, but work is underway to prepare for potential peacekeeping. The situation is moving incredibly quickly. Not quickly enough, I think, if you're someone in Ukraine who's fighting for their life and their freedom. But the situation is now moving quickly. The Prime Minister's working closely with international allies to try and make sure that we don't just bring an end to the war, but we secure the peace.
All right. You've written this morning that you plan to get rid of hundreds of the regulatory bodies cluttering the patient safety landscape. For example?
Well, don't want to get ahead of Dr. Penny Dash's review, which is coming to me.
She's the chair of the NHS.
She's the incoming chair of NHS England, but which she'd previously been asked to do a review all of the regulators, of which there are many in the NHS, many of which are working at cross purposes, many of which are trying to do the same thing. And so what I will do with colleagues across government who are also doing similar work is look at how we can reduce the number of regulators, how we can reduce the number of regulations wherever possible to provide the level of clarity for the system, particularly where it concerns patient safety, because if you're clear about what you're supposed to be doing, why you're supposed to be doing it, you're more likely to do it. Simplicity, but also trying to reduce the amount of money we're spending.
But potentially getting rid of the regulators of patient safety would lessen patient safety.
No, quite the opposite, Trevor. At the moment, we have ended up over many years now building up under our predecessor an approach that says, if there's a problem, let's introduce a new organisation, a new arm's length body to deal with it. And actually that can breed inefficiency and duplication, and we want to try and streamline that. This week we've announced the abolition of the biggest arm's length body in the country, in the world, which is NHS England, because we can see that there is duplication, there is waste, there is inefficiency, not for any fault of the people working in it, but because of the system they are set up to work in. So wherever possible, I want to reduce the amount of money we're spending on things that are duplication, waste, or inefficient, or working at cross purposes.
Well, let's, for viewers' sake, make this concrete. Let's have a look at the list of the biggest ones, the 21 agencies and public bodies that are working with the Department of Health. Any of these for the chop?
Quite possibly, but I'm not...
Come on, give us a clue.
I'm not giving you any new announcements today. I'm working through the consequences of
how many will we come down to then, roughly then,
and I'm not going to do the business of arbitrary numbers either. I think what you've seen this week is our determination to reduce, wherever possible, those things which are not adding value or which are wasting taxpayers' money or not delivering for patients. And in the case of NHS England, what we've had in the NHS for some years now is effectively two headquarters. And if you compare the size of those two organisations combined, about 19,000 people, double what it was in 2010 when we were delivering the shortest waiting times and the highest patient satisfaction ever. So what we're doing by abolishing NHS England is making sure that we've got one head office, a smaller, leaner, more efficient head office, saving hundreds of millions of pounds to put towards the front line, delivering better care for patients and better value for taxpayers.
You said that you wouldn't do top-down top-down reorganisation. Well, to some extent you're doing that now. But I just want to ask you very quickly about something else. Is it right that Jim Mackey, the head of the NHS England, has written to local health boards demanding that they produce plans for a 50% reduction in their spending?
In integrated care boards, yes, with a particular focus on management costs.
Cutting half?
We came, myself and Jim, are confronting a financial planning round for the year ahead where systems returned financial plans to us that would have involved a overspend between £5 and £6 billion before the new financial year has even begun. And I'm afraid this speaks to the culture that I identified before the general election, where the NHS is addicted to overspending, is addicted to running up routine deficits with the assumption that someone will come along to bail them out in a way that, by the way, local councils would never be able to do. Are
you saying that the NHS or the apparatus of the NHS was basically wasting public money?
I think there's definitely examples of waste, inefficiency, duplication, and we're going to go hard at it. Look, even if the public finances weren't tight, and they are, but even if they weren't, I don't think even in the good times it's acceptable that taxpayers' money is wasted, because the money you're wasting could be spent on other public priorities, or the money that's being wasted could be put back into the pockets of taxpayers who would quite like some of it back.
50% cut in spending, how is that different from austerity, George Osborne's word?
Because there is £26 billion more going into the NHS for the year ahead. When you look at the decisions the Chancellor made at the last budget, it was not cutting spending, quite the opposite. So what we're going after is, I'm afraid, some of the culture and practice that's been allowed up in the NHS, which, by the way, it isn't just frustrating patients and taxpayers, it's frustrating for the staff working in the NHS because they can see the waste and inefficiency. They can see the layer upon layer upon layer of bureaucracy and accountability. That's not the fault of the people working in the system. They are also victims of it. And that's why we're going hard at achieving those savings in order to redeploy money into frontline services which benefit patients. Because, Trevor, at the moment, I'm responsible for an NHS that can't guarantee an ambulance will arrive on time. I'm responsible for an NHS where people can't always get a GP appointment when they need one, where NHS dentistry is barely existent in parts of the country. So there are fundamental problems I need to fix, and in order to fix those problems, not only will we put more money in, which we are, but as I've said consistently since before the election, it will be matched with the reform to make sure we deliver better outcomes for patients and better value for taxpayers.
And your central reform idea is what you call democratic control, what most people would say, putting it in the hands of politicians. In practice, aren't you just replacing a large group of bureaucrats with possibly a smaller group of bureaucrats who happen to be under your control, but will probably take twice as long to make decisions?
No, I think it's more fundamental than that. Yes, we want democratic accountability, because this is one of the most important public services in our country, and patients and taxpayers deserve to know that when they elect a government, the government will deliver on their priorities. But secondly, what we'll be doing with our 10-year plan is the biggest evolution of power in the history of the NHS, because actually, and this is the difference between political control and clinical control, I actually want more clinicians, more consultants, more nurses. I want them actually driving the reform with more power, more responsibility at the front line, instead of constantly looking upwards to a mountain of accountability.
But in the end, if you are calling the shot, you're taking responsibility.
Absolutely. Well, I was anyway. I mean, I love this idea that because of these reforms, the health secretary will now get the blame. I mean, I was always going to get the blame. What I'd like to do is actually get the credit for doing things that are going to make a real difference, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to preside over a system that I don't think is working. I do want to take umbrage with one thing as well, Trevor. When you talk about, one group of bureaucrats to another, I do just want to make this point that even within an organisational setup that I think needs to go, there are lots of dedicated public servants, and I don't sort of take the view that they're all kind of pen-pushing bureaucrats. They care about patients. There are lots of jobs at risk, and they're decent people.
You said that, but just let me very quickly ask you this. If they're so brilliant and so dedicated and so on, is it wise to go about calling them flabby, as Prime Minister did last week? And in your piece today, you talk about a bloated bureaucracy. Those are the people that you've just called brilliant, dedicated and so on. They're flabby, bloated. What are they?
No, we're talking about the system, not the people who work in it. And by the way, many of the criticisms...
Yeah, but they're going to hear it as them.
Well, there's two things I say. Many of the people who work in the NHS would agree entirely with the criticism I've made about the layers of bureaucracy about the fact that there is lots of man-marking and duplication between the department and NHS England, which is intolerable and wasteful and inefficient. They'd all agree with that.
Right.
But will there be lots of people this weekend who are deeply anxious about their jobs and their futures? Absolutely.
Right.
And I'm genuinely sorry about that because I don't want them to be in that position. But I've got to make the changes that I think are necessary to deliver better outcomes.
OK, we've got that point. It's 10 days to go before Chancellor makes her spring statement. She's looking for cuts in spending. Can we just get clear? Are personal independence payments going to be diminished in real value or are they going to be abolished?
We have to wait and see the proposals. I've not seen the full package of proposals yet. And I think what we've had is lots of speculation. No, we haven't had a discussion about the welfare package in Cabinet. But that will be coming to Cabinet.
That's interesting, because everybody's reporting endlessly that there's division in Cabinet and you've discussed it and people have been... One lot have said this and another lot have said that. So you haven't talked about it at all?
Well, sometimes I read reports of Cabinet and wonder if it was the same meeting I attended. But regardless, look, what we're trying to achieve with welfare reform is to make sure that the welfare system does the two things it needs to do. One is to support people who cannot work, to make sure they've got dignity, independence, quality of life. And secondly, for those who can, to make sure that the welfare system isn't just a safety net, but a springboard back to work. We've now got 1 in 8 young people in this country out of work. 1,000 people every day are signing on to personal independence payments. 1,000 a day. That's, over the course of a year, size of the city of Manchester. And we've got to make sure that this system delivers for those who need it most and is sustainable for the long term and provides the right kind of support for the different types of need that exist within that group.
That we've got 2.8 million people, or probably more now, who are receiving benefits because they can't go to work. The number of people who have are claiming benefits because of mental health conditions has gone up to more than 500,000. Are people being signed off too easily these days?
Well, the system is definitely unsustainable if it carries on growing at this rate. And I think...
Well, that's a separate point. I think... The question... I understand the point about the spending. I'm asking you, though, if the judgments that are being made about who gets welfare benefits and gets signed off work, whether we're now in a situation where it's too easy to get these benefits?
Well, I think there's sometimes a presumption in favour of the benefit system. I'll give you an actual example. A friend of mine, diagnosed with cancer, uncertain prognosis, was told in the conversation, I can sign you on to the welfare system if you want to stop working. And she said, well, why on earth would I want to stop working? I'm to all intents and purposes, able to carry on. I want to carry on. The presumption on the part of the person having the conversation was the presumption that someone would want to stop working. Similarly...
So you want to stop all of that?
Well, I think there's certainly a question about making sure people have got the right support to stay in work wherever possible. That is, and from a health perspective, going out to work is better for your mental and physical health than being stuck at home. There are lots of people out there at the moment who feel trapped in the benefit system because, and this is something I know Liz Kendall is going to address, the Work and Pension Secretary. If you're someone who is in the benefit system, there's a job opportunity available, and you think, I might be able to take the plunge and go for it, you're stuck in this trap of jeopardy because you think, if I take it and it doesn't work out, I go straight back to square one, not onto the benefits I was on before, but right back to applying for the benefits, going through what can be an ordeal of applying. So there are lots of things that we are going to do to support people back to work, to provide more security and more of a springboard. So I just sort of say, because we're going to wait until we see the proposals, but it's just important to say that we've seen partial accounts in the media of things that the government might or might not do.
Let me just ask you...
And I think we've got to wait and see the whole range of
Let me just ask you one last question, which is really about the nature of government. Your former colleague, Ed Balls, said this week about the... essentially the explanation you've just given about what you want to do on welfare benefits, that cutting benefits of the most vulnerable in our society who can't work to pay for defence, not going to work. It's not a Labour thing to do. And you yourself said, by the way, this week that you more or less bragged that you are doing the things that the Conservative Party wanted to do but didn't do. And you said, I bet they're glad that people chose change with Labour. Some of your less favourable friends are saying the change with Labour is that Labour's changing into the Tories.
No, look, I kind of reject that argument. I don't think that it is a Labour argument to say that we would want people consigned to a life on benefit and not able to go to work when we know that they can.
Winter fuel allowance cuts, benefit cuts.
We would also, I think I'd also say that the situation we've inherited in terms of the level of spending, the level of borrowing, the level of national debt, that is not a position the Labour Party is happy with. What we are absolutely doing is trying to reform the state so that it's more effective, get our economy growing again so that we can invest in our public services without hiking taxes and put more money back into people's pockets. Those are Labour things to do. And when you look at the welfare system as it is today, the number of people who feel trapped in it, the number of people who need it and aren't getting the support, the range of support they need, that's why this system needs fundamental reform. And you know, I have a lot of respect for what lots of commentators, including Ed Balls, have said, but I just respectfully say people are commenting on speculative reports in the media, not actual proposals. Let's wait and see the proposals, and then let's have a debate about whether they're right. But we're determined to make sure people get the support they need to get back to work, and where they can't work, to have a good quality life.
I look forward to that debate. Wes Streeting, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, let's see what our panel made of all that. We're joined all morning by three people who cut their political teeth across the aisle. James Purnell was Work and Pensions Secretary under Gordon Brown. Joe Swinson was Liberal Democrat leader before Sir Ed Davey, and former Conservative leader Sir Ian Duncan Smith spent 6 years as Work and Pensions Secretary. Let me start with you, James. Prime Minister, state is flabby. We're streeting. Bloated bureaucracy, the NHS addicted to overspending. This is not the sort of language we normally associate with Labour governments.
I think they're trying to walk quite a careful line here, which is the public are very disillusioned with the state, and they also feel they've inherited a state that isn't working the way that they want to. So if they sound like they're defenders of that state, they're very worried that that's going to mean that grievance against the state turns against them very quickly. So what they're trying to say is what they're attacking is that the system, which is trapping the civil servants and the public servants and not bringing the best out of their talents. But you're right, it is a tricky balance to strike, because you also have to have those public servants on your side wanting to deliver for you. So I understand why they're doing it, and in the end, governments have to focus on the electorate and make sure that they're delivering on their priorities.
Joe, they're saying, indeed, Wes Streeting said to me this morning, it's the system, but he's sacking 10,000 people.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem is not necessarily all of the detail. I mean, clearly removing duplication, there's some sense in that. But I think the problem is the way that it sounds like he's trying to pick a fight. And I was speaking to a friend of mine who's a consultant in the NHS, and she said that, you know, this week in the hospitals, it felt like everything was just a little bit more fraught. And she said it's hard to know if that's exactly as a result of the changes that were announced earlier this week, but the fact that they were very much a shock and surprising to people. It wasn't even very senior people like Chris Whitty didn't know until just before. So this is something that wasn't expected, and it also looks like it's just the beginning of a whole raft of these types of decisions. And I think we need to recognise, there's the people in NHS England, obviously, who will be worried about their jobs. But there's 1.5 million people working in the NHS in England. And this will affect all of those in terms of the uncertainty, in terms of what they can expect to happen. And some of that might be unavoidable, but you can do it in a way that helps to reassure people that there is a plan, that they are valued, or you can do it in a way that is combative and picks a fight. And I know which one of those ways is going to get the best out of those staff. And why do we have this issue? I mean, 5 years ago, almost exactly now, we were hearing that we were going to go into lockdown for a massive global pandemic. I mean, that's actually only 5 years. So the fact that there is a big problem in the NHS, we've got burnout of staff who've been dealing with that, and we've got the backlog of all of these health conditions, naturally the health service is going to need attention. Naturally it's going to need resources.
Ian, do you think, well, Joe's raised a question, is this the best way to go about what I think everybody seems to think is the right thing, which is to kind of slim it down, reform and all the rest of it? Have they chosen the right path?
With the NHS? Yeah, well, I'll be honest with you, I've lost count how many governments, doesn't matter the Labour or Conservative, and this applies also to the Blair government as well, as the Conservatives, start by talking in headlines. So government ministers talk in headlines to get the headlines. In actual fact, the detail of how you do this, of those of us who have been in government, and all three of us have, you then suddenly realise is much more complex than that, because you're having to deal with vast moving parts. So the reality is you need a target as to what you're trying to do. You need to work to that, but at the same time, you need to bring in those who are going to make that change for you in government, incentivise them, inspire them, and get them to do that job. And for example, with NHS England, I've got no problems with getting rid of NHS England. It's not something I ever thought would work. I thought the Lansley reforms genuinely weren't great. I was in Cabinet at the time.
Were you in favour of it at the time?
No, I wasn't in favour at the time because we hadn't discussed it. The welfare reform stuff that we brought in had been debated and debated and debated outside of government. The Lansley reforms were never debated until we arrived in government. That's the wrong way to do it, by the way, and have to say they may be walking into that trap if they're not careful.
Oh, OK.
So you have to be very careful about what you understand the detail of to get it done. And then things are moving underneath you. For example, one figure to do with welfare that has not really been looked at, the number of households where no one is in work has risen to by 141,000 in the last 4 or 5 years. Now, that's to do with COVID. The massive impact of COVID, we are not even talking about what effect did it have on households. So these are the things that you need to know. The same with health service.
Yes,
it's had a massive impact on the health service.
It was a strange reform, though. At the same time that Michael Gove was sort of devolving power, there was this very strange reform to kind of split the NHS and Department of Health in two. And I think fundamentally the problem was it didn't work and results got worse. I think, to your point, what Wes and the government will be hoping is results improve. So waiting lists are coming down now, and that will build its own momentum within the NHS.
Their theory was, of course, that it was taking the politics out of the NHS. That was the whole thing. The other arm of what they are pitching as reform is welfare. This is a very, very hard tone. Joe, I got from Wes Streeting when I asked him whether he thought it was too easy to claim benefits. He can't say yes, but I got the sense that actually, yeah, that's what we think.
Which I think is problematic, because if you look at the statistics of how many people in the country are experiencing greater health impacts, mental health and physical health impacts, the increases in people having back pain, musculoskeletal conditions, and very significantly in mental health problems, that's real, right? So if you just say, well, the solution to that is that we make swinging cuts to the welfare, then you might save a bit of money in your government budget, but you're not actually making people's lives better. You know, the idea that people in that scenario, it's just that they need a bit of a kick to get into work. Actually, I think it would be better to look at, OK, so what does the labour market need to look like to support people, right? What are the jobs that can be, supported and encouraged that will be flexible for people who might have a condition that is going to mean that the requirement to work at kind of full pelt constantly is not something that they can do. And indeed, I think the shift to the more gig economy has actually made the labour market a harsher place for many people to engage with, and particularly difficult for people who have a disability or a health condition that fluctuates.
The politics of this, Ian, are there more people, as it were, swinging the lead, or is there just a sort of long-term, real structural problem? You had to tackle this for many years. What's your view?
Well, it's a little bit of both. You'll always get people who want to take advantage of the system and find ways to do it. If you go on the internet, you'll see the endless amounts of advice about how you are able to claim various benefits. The key thing, though, here is that saving money in welfare at the end of the day doesn't really come from freezes. You can get temporary savings from that, and you can all those other. But the reality is shifting the dial and focus. So, for example, what's happened now, which is the thing that's changed over the last 10 years, is that the proportion of those who claim, for example, sickness benefit, 60% claim mental health issues. Yeah. It used to be musculoskeletal, the old back problem. That is now shrinking into a much smaller group. And the problem with that is, we did the Centre for Social Justice, which I set up, did a report on this the other day, and they talked to GPs. 84% said they are now worried that we are medicalising what are the normals, ups and downs of life, and thus saying to people, don't work. But the reality is, if you got, of all those mental health claims, about 50 to 60% are anxiety and depression. They are very treatable conditions, and the biggest treatment is work. There's the irony. If you sit someone at home with that, they get worse. So now, up until then, sickness benefit and disability benefits were outside of universal credit. For the first time, it's coming in to universal credit. That will allow them to put work coaches alongside all those people and start pushing to work. The savings from that is what you get. And that's a positive saving because you're improving people's lives.
Let's carry this on in a moment, but it is just gone 9 o'clock. You're watching Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. In the last half hour, the Health Secretary has told this programme that the NHS is addicted to overspending, as he confirmed that local care boards have been asked to make deep 50% cuts to boost efficiency. West Streeting also refused to be drawn on the nature of welfare spending cuts due to be announced next week, denying reports that the Cabinet has been consulted on them. Well, stick around. We've plenty more from our panel in the next hour, but in a moment, we'll hear from the Shadow Education Secretary, the Conservative MP Laura Trott. And then, after yesterday's virtual meeting of dozens of world leaders, we'll assess the UK's role in laying the foundations for a ceasefire in Ukraine. We'll be joined live by the former National Security Advisor, Lord Peter Ricketts. Now, cast your minds back 15 years. In its first days, the coalition government launched a plan to axe vast swathes of arm's-length bodies to curb public spending, in what soon became known as the bonfire of the Quangos. This week, Labour started a bonfire of its own by scrapping NHS England, in a surprise move that seems to have divided the Conservative Party. Earlier, I spoke to their Shadow Education Secretary, Laura Trott. Laura Trott, the former Conservative Minister, Lord Bethell, reacted to the abolition of the NHS England by saying, "I wish we'd had the guts to do this." Do you agree that the Tories just funked it?
No, I don't. The reforms that we brought in I think it was 2013, were well-intentioned, but it's clear
the
they
Lansley
haven't...
reforms,
yeah,
disastrous.
They haven't worked in the way that they were intended to. But obviously we had the pandemic. It would be not, I think, the best idea to do a top-down NHS reorganisation directly after a pandemic. But I do agree in principle with what Wes is putting forward. But I think people at home should be aware that this isn't a silver bullet. This system exists in Wales, where the waiting lists are the highest in the UK. The changes will also result in costs and disruption, and we'll need to see a very clear plan from the government for how that won't affect waiting lists further.
But you could have done it, couldn't you? You could have done some. I understand you couldn't have done it after the pandemic,
Exactly.
but you had, what, 8 years before then?
Yeah, but the reforms were just in and they were bedding. I think it was clear at that point.
You brought them in 2012, pandemic happened 2021.
2020.
2020.
Yeah, exactly. But when they came in like 2013, I think. But it was just, what I'm saying is, yes, I agree with the principle. I think if we tried to do this after the pandemic, it would have been a disaster. So
Okay.
I think it's right to wait.
All right, we're coming up to spring statement. The Chancellor will make her wishes known when it comes to welfare benefits. You were both Chief Secretaries of the Treasury and Pensions Minister. Will you support cuts in disability benefits?
I think on the specifics, I want to wait to see what the government brings forward. But I think it's really important to remember that at the election, Labour said we could save no money from welfare. There was no welfare bill on reform in the King's speech. They've lost so much time when it was obvious to everyone that this was a benefit system that needed to be brought back under control post the pandemic. We'd taken some steps, which have been scored by the OBR, which is the kind of fiscal regulator, but there was more to do, and we had a plan at the election to do so. Labour are coming to this too late, without a plan. They're clearly divided on it, and that is not what our welfare system needs.
You let 1 million extra people go on personal independent payments since the pandemic. You just let this thing run out of control.
Well, as I said, obviously the pandemic had an impact on the welfare system. I think everybody agrees with that.
No.
Everybody agrees that there were steps that needed to be taken to bring it back under control.
We're now up to nearly 3 million people.
Yes, we'd
who are
started
being
that
signed
process.
off.
Yes, we started that process before the election. It was in a number of our fiscal events, and they were bringing it down slowly. There were further we wanted the steps that we wanted to take. We set those out at the election, They were not taken up by the Labour Party. They're coming to this later on, as I said, divided and seemingly without any plan at all.
Is this your version of the Labour Party's view that the Tories created a problem that is an issue for everything they do? You are now saying that the pandemic seems to be responsible for all the things you failed to do.
No, I think, Trevor, it's pretty unambiguous that the pandemic had an impact across our society in many ways.
Yeah, but you could have done something about this.
We were doing things about it, and we have further steps to take. We set those out at the election. The Labour Party rejected those. They said there was no money to be saved from welfare at the election. I remember that very clearly. They're now coming to it chaotically, too late, without a plan, just ahead of their emergency budget.
All right, your leader said that she's not in any hurry to bring in policies. There's going to be policy groups set up and all of that. But let's just talk about a couple of issues in your area, education. Ian Duncan Smith this morning has suggested that there should be job coaches in schools. Is that the kind of thing that you've got in mind for your policy groups?
Bringing education closer to the jobs market, I think, is very important. It's why we have questioned the bill that Labour have brought forward on abolishing the Institute for Apprenticeship and Technical Education, because it's actually taking employers out of the apprenticeship system, which we think is a very bad thing to do. That will be something that we will be looking to strengthen after the next election. But my main focus at the moment, Trevor, is on fighting Labour's disastrous schools bill, which has elements in there which will destroy the cross-party consensus on education that we've had over decades in this country.
Which is about academies and so on.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, actually, let me ask you about that. You've come out this morning to say that you want to ban mobile phones in schools.
Yes.
Same time, you're criticising the Education Secretary for curbing academy schools' freedoms, set their own targets and rules. Make up your mind. Are you in favour of academies being able to decide, for example, whether their pupils have mobile phones or not? Or are you in favour of top-down diktats that say no school must have mobile phones?
I'm in favour of consistent safeguarding across the board, and that academies
of
being
telling
allowed...
school leaders what to do, then?
No, it's safeguarding for children. We know that mobile phones are damaging. They impact children in the classroom, they impact behaviour, they impact educational attainment. It's something that parents and teachers across the country are looking for us to do something about. We've tried guidance. The guidance has not been effective. We know only 11% of schools have a proper mobile phone ban in place, and that's why we're taking these steps. At the same time...
But how do you know better than the school leader in Swindon or in Gateshead what is right for his or her school?
This is something that teachers are asking for us to do.
Some teachers?
Well, and the education unions as well. This is something that is supported by the education unions, it is supported by teachers, it's supported by parents. We know it's an issue, we know it's a safeguarding issue.
So the Tories are now being guided by teaching unions?
No, I'm merely pointing out, you said that some teachers, I was pointing out there is support for this, Trevor.
Research by the National Association of Head Teachers showed that 8 out of 10 school leaders have been abused by parents in the last year. I think 1 in 10 head teachers say they faced actual violence. I understand your point about phones, but are you sure that it's the children and their phones that you should be targeting for improved behaviours? What about the parents?
I think that this is an extremely important issue. We've seen behaviour deteriorate in recent years, which is not helped by the government withdrawing funding and support for behaviour hubs across the country. It is something that we absolutely need to be focusing on as a country and as a government, which is why it is such a mistake for the Education Secretary to be pushing forward with a schools bill which will damage education standards in this country, while there's so much else which needs to be done.
But that's not really anything to do with parents, is it? I mean...
No, but what I'm saying is that there are things that we need to focus on in this country in schools that are really big problems at the moment.
Right.
Absenteeism, behaviour in schools, abuse of teachers, teacher recruitment, all those things need to be done and sorted. And if they brought forward proposals on that, we will be supportive of those.
Sorry, did you say abuse of teachers? Oh, abuse of teachers.
Yes, yes.
OK, let's just talk about politics, if we may. So this is a politics show. If he applies to join the Conservative Party, would you welcome Mr Rupert Lowe?
Look, I'm not focused on any individual MP in Parliament. What I'm focused on is the number of people who are thinking about voting reform, who we need to convince to come back to the Conservative Party, who I recognise we lost their trust at the last election. They need to know that we've changed, and look, under Kemi, that process is
Well, one of the
underway.
reasons they're not coming back to you, because the polls aren't moving, is that Labour looks like it's trying to do all the things that you said you'd do but didn't do, and the reform is promising all the things. Reforms promising all the things that you'd like
destroying the
to
economy,
promise.
taking winter fuel payment away from pensioners, destroying education standards. This is not like a halcyon Labour government. It's a disaster for this country.
No, but
and we are the ones who are the main opposition. And we're having to deal with this supermajority in Parliament at the moment because reform enabled the Labour Party at the last election. That's why we're in the situation we are at the moment.
I'm simply saying nobody quite knows what the Tories are for right now.
Well, the Tories are for a system whereby we allow employers to employ people without exorbitant costs, which is what the Labour Party are putting on people at the moment. We are for making sure that pensioners can heat their homes in the winter. And we're for a brilliant education system, which is one that we have where teachers are free to teach what they want in the classrooms, where we have innovation backed up by rigorous inspection. That is all being undermined by the Labour Party.
Laura Trott, thank you very much for your time this
Thank you.
morning. Back to our panel, James Purnell, Joe Swinson and Sir Ian Duncan Smith. Ian, I want to ask you about the job coaches thing in a second, but James, I didn't give you a chance to weigh in on the benefits issue before 9 o'clock.
Well, I think it's important to say that the welfare bill is still going to be going up. So sometimes when you can sort of see the coverage, it feels like this is about cutting welfare. This is actually about reducing quite rapid growth in the amount of welfare. And it's interesting to have had both Health Secretary of State and the shadow on education on, because if you're Rachel Reeves, this is kind of the decision. If you let welfare grow faster, then that's going to displace funding for health and education, and that will mean potentially less support for those disabled people who want help with their conditions and less growth for our country. So they're trying to think about it holistically. I think fundamentally, I would agree with Ian in one large respect, which is the balance between support for work and people being having to resort to disability benefits has got a bit out of kilter, just because the amount that you get on disability benefits has gone up whilst the amount that you get for the old job seekers element has stayed much lower. One of the things that we wanted to do just before Ian took over was introducing a jobs guarantee, which we were piloting at the time, which would have meant more support for unemployed people, people looking for work. They'd have known that they were going to get a job. That was being piloted. Unfortunately, it was cut. But that's one of the things which we need to look at in the system, is how we can provide guarantees for people to get into work so that there is less of an incentive to try and get yourself onto the higher rate.
Ian, you've come up with this idea, which I think is sort of more of a upstream idea of job coaches in schools.
Yeah, what we forget right now is one of the biggest problems that's putting a real pressure on welfare is, A, the nature of family breakdown at the moment in the communities. It's at a sort of astonishing high. And a lot of, as I said earlier on, the figure for the number of households where no adult is working has risen by 141,000. If you live in a household where no one works, there's by and large been peripatetic work anyway, the chances of you going through the education system, first of all, and then coming out in a productive manner are falling. So what you have to do is find out how do you intervene somewhere in this that helps. I did this as a trial when I was at welfare. What I did was I asked for a particular school to look at putting jobs coaches, not going in to teach them, but for kids that are around about 13, which is the point when they start to disappear out of school if they can't see the point in education. You put them in, and what they do is explain to those children, OK, here's what happens when you leave with no qualifications. In this area, these are the jobs that you have a chance of getting. It's very small. And then they tell them, but with 1 or 2 qualifications, maybe maths, something else, this is where it opens up. These are the businesses that are in here. And then you bring businesses in to talk to them.
What did it show? What did the pilot show?
It showed, actually, that it was a real refocus. It didn't go as long as years, but it was over the period they were in, it began to refocus the kids' view of what happens when you leave school. Because if they're watching their parents unemployed, nothing going on, they think, I want to get money. They don't. And we have this sort of middle-class view of careers. It's jobs.
I was going to say, isn't this what careers advisors used to do?
No. This is jobs advice, not careers. The point is, I've always had a problem with people going into school saying, we know what your career will be. The truth is, lots of these kids want work because they want money. And so the question you've got to try and put to them through that route is, here's therefore what you can do. That helps them rethink about education and the purpose of it. Otherwise, they have no idea. They think they're in school because they have to be, and at the end of it, they just want to get out and earn money. If you let them get out too early, They're in the hands of the street gangs.
Joe,
And this is the point, really.
Joe, picking up James's point, the benefits bill's still going to keep going up. I mean, this is basically government chasing after a juggernaut, a train that's running away from us.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that this is a challenge, but I mean, where I agree with Ian is that it's not something that you can really solve by just kind of going after this little pot of money here or there. It's actually about understanding what is happening in people's lives, right? So whether it's they've got significant health problems, and that has increased post-pandemic, lots more people with long COVID, for example, how do we make sure that we can put the health support in place for people so that they can live fulfilling lives, or whether it's indeed about what people's understanding is of the job market. I mean, the number of young people in particular not in education and training is a very concerning number. And I mean, this is a cohort who, again, were massively impacted by the pandemic in terms of where it came in their educational experience. And I think in terms of an intergenerational perspective, we often sort of forget that the pandemic was a massive issue, and for those of us who are adults, it was it was a few years of our life. But if you're a teenager, it was absolutely formative in terms of your social relationships, your confidence. And I kind of think we've sort of just all moved on because it's quite traumatic to think about, rather than trying to understand how do we then give those young people the springboard that they deserve.
Laura's making essentially the same point about the impact of the pandemic, wasn't she? Ian? She was.
And what I wanted to make was the universal credit didn't have sickness benefit in it. It was meant to have, chancellors wouldn't invest to do it, and disability, they're both outside universal credit. Nobody sees you if you're on sickness benefit, so you languish away without anyone talking to you about what you could do. It's coming in now to universal credit. The last government started it. I hope this government pursue it. This allows you to be pretty radical straight away and will save probably up to 32 billion once it gets in. Why? Because now everybody on sickness benefit can be seen by somebody and helped, pushed into work to help their condition. And interestingly enough, when we've seen that done, it has a dramatic effect on people. That is the longer-term way to save money on this. Not that long, by the way, because it starts working. I'd say to the government, one thing to do, get rid of the requirement never to have work. Just say go from sickness benefit. Everybody can do something. Let's see what you can do, and let's start trying to move you into that. And the one downside, I wish the Chancellor hadn't gone and put that 5,000 starting point on national insurance, because that's the real stepping stone into work. She needs to rethink that.
This was an obstacle for low-paid employers. Employment. Yeah. Just lastly, James, are you comfortable with the new tone from Labour?
Am I comfortable with it?
Yes.
I like the reforming courage of the government. I think they have inherited a completely different circumstance from the one that we inherited. And, you can kind of think back to 97, we had 5% growth in the first year of that government. The Cold War dividend meant that we were going from spending 4-5% on defence, going down to spending below 2%. So the inheritance they have is completely different from the one that we had then. We've got public spending probably at the highest it can possibly be. So what they have to do is to look at switch spending. So when you're talking about the difficult choices that they're making, that is to be able to then invest in the NHS, it's to be able to invest in schools. So I have, a huge amount of sympathy for what is a fantastically difficult situation compared to any that's been inherited in my lifetime.
OK, thank you. Next, we'll discuss the Prime Minister's so-called coalition of the willing over Ukraine with the former National Security Advisor, Lord Ricketts.
I'm Stephen Murphy, and I'm Sky's Ireland correspondent based here in Dublin.
All alcohol products, not just wine, will have labels warning of liver disease and the link to fatal cancers.
Is it crazy? It's an industry worth around €14 billion a year. That's why Italy sees this Irish plan as such a threat.
It's always instructive and occasionally entertaining to hear what Donald Trump has to say on the issue of Brexit.
She's got her own way of doing it, that's okay.
The job takes me to every corner of this island.
The rioting stemmed from a horrific daytime stabbing attack at a primary school in the city centre.
The scale of the rioting and the destruction it caused is pretty much unprecedented here in Dublin.
Jerry, any comment on the judge's decision? Do you feel vindicated, Jerry? This is the end, the somewhat chaotic end
of a 52-day Trott.
Micheál Martin could be set to head back to government with the Taoiseach Simon Harris.
Are you confident that you can now return as Taoiseach?
I'm cautiously optimistic and excited.
A mystery press conference hastily called. Leo Varadkar strode out and didn't disappoint.
I am resigning as President and Leader of Fine Gael effective today.
The people here sometimes feel they're somewhat neglected by the Irish government, to the extent that this place is sometimes known as the Forgotten County.
The waters of Ireland and Britain should be home to great white sharks, but none have ever been found.
If there are great white sharks in this area, there's no reason they wouldn't come here to feed. It's basically a buffet on a beach.
This could be not only a record-breaking storm, but potentially the most dangerous storm ever to hit Ireland.
Sky News, get the full story first.
We are under Israeli military restrictions in terms of some of the things that we can film, but it's important to be in there. What a slow drive for the President as he approaches his golf club.
4 more years!
Free wherever you get your news.
I'm Mark Stone and I'm Sky's correspondent based here in Washington, D.C.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story.
I'm ready. Are you?
Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
Sky News, get the full story first.
Is this now all your territory?
Yeah. The battlefield is outside the barricades. We are in the middle of a forest, in a jungle really, and they're attempting to keep these men alive. I'm Stuart Ramsey, and I'm Sky's chief correspondent. It's really dangerous. Many people have died riding it.
We're rolling.
Welcome to the world.
Our new podcast, starting now. It's very exciting. Every week, we'll be reporting from the world's trouble spots.
We get to hold those in positions of power accountable, and we get to ask the questions that the audience, the listeners, want to know about.
And that's why it is so important that people tune in, come along for the road, come along for the journey. It'll be fun.
Welcome back. As talks to secure peace in Ukraine began in Jeddah this week, it's become clear that Russia wants a ceasefire only on its terms. And the United States has little appetite to be the security backstop. The Prime Minister hosted nearly 30 world leaders in a virtual meeting of Ukraine's allies yesterday. But where could his so-called coalition of the willing stand in all this? Let's speak to the former National Security Advisor, Lord Ricketts. Morning, Peter.
Good morning.
Is the prospect of a peacekeeping force involving NATO boots on the ground a real one or just a negotiating tactic?
Well, I think Keir Starmer's done an excellent job in the 3 weeks since that ambush in the Oval Office in pulling the Europeans together, in developing a plan for how Europe can really make a contribution towards peace in Ukraine. And I can absolutely see why he's promoting the idea of a military force. But I've been in the room many times as a policymaker when ministers were deciding put troops into Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. And it's now you've got to ask the tough questions because the intentions are absolutely honest, of course, and I respect that. But what would a European force actually do in Ukraine? We hear much of this term, a reassurance force, which sounds quite reassuring. What it really means is a deterrent force, I think, a force capable of deterring Putin from going back to war in Ukraine. To be credible, a deterrence force has to be willing to fight. So are we actually saying that this force might one day have to fight the Russians in Ukraine? I think it's a genuine question. And the way to avoid it, of course, is to have a cast-iron American guarantee that if the force got into trouble, the Americans would come in and support. That's what the backstop means. I just don't think Trump is going to give that kind of commitment. So while I admire the work going into this, and maybe there are ways that European forces can help in Ukraine, perhaps training and in the background, I think a formed fighting force is a considerable risk without an American clear guarantee.
Do you think that guarantee will ever be forthcoming from this president?
Frankly, no, because Trump's brand is to pull Americans out of military conflict. I mean, he hit the Houthis overnight, but that's with long-range missiles, no American troops anywhere near Yemen. So I don't think that he will give a credible guarantee that if a European force got into real trouble, he would come to the rescue. And again, implicitly take on the Russians directly. And the Russians will, of course, confront a force in Ukraine. One of their great grievances has been that NATO has been moving towards Russian frontiers.
That's what Putin said this was all about.
The last thing they want is to see NATO forces running around in Ukraine. So they're bound to take the force on in some way, whether actually conflict directly or dark arts, deniable operations, sabotage. I don't know. It would be a very risky situation unless the Russians are prepared to accept this force, which I don't see as likely either.
So what do you think Keir Starmer is doing here? Because presumably he must be getting wise advice of the kind that you're giving.
I mean, I suppose he's preparing the ground for, if we did get that kind of American security guarantee, then the Europeans must be ready to follow through with the force. Fine. But I think also the meeting yesterday was talking about other ways of supporting Ukraine, which are equally valid. More arms, more equipment, tighter sanctions on Russia, using some of those frozen Russian assets for reconstruction in Ukraine. That's all pressure on Russia. And if we're going to get Russia to a sensible negotiation around the table, there's got to be serious pressure on Russia as well. We haven't seen very much of that so far.
Well, when we talk about serious pressure, I mean, the White House has talked about, or the president has talked about things that he could do to Russia that nobody's understood yet, that would be disastrous. The call yesterday talked about more sanctions and so on. Are the sanctions actually working? They don't seem to have impeded Mr. Putin's progress at all.
Well, I think they have weakened the Russian economy. You don't see it very much from the outside, but the sanctions on technology transfers to Russia, for example, I think are meaning that the Russian economy is weakening inside. It hasn't stopped Putin being able to fund the war, no. And one step which really would do that would be to depress the oil price, because the Russian economy is very, very dependent on oil prices. And that is something that Trump has mentioned. But I have to say that the pressure put on Ukraine has been much more specific than anything that we know he said to Putin. So I think in the next round of this, when the Americans have to compare the Ukraine offer to go straight away to a ceasefire for 30 days with this Putin proposal, which is yes, but a whole series of conditions, we need to feel that the Americans are putting much more pressure on Putin, including threatening much tougher sanctions.
I'm always a bit reluctant to put down geopolitics to relationships between individuals, because I think that's a lot of that is for journalists. But objective forces, how many guns have you got, economy and so on, are much more influential. However, there are a couple of big relationships here. One is between interestingly, Starmer and Macron, and I'm curious what you think about this. Macron likes the idea of French leadership, like all French presidents do, of Europe. Do you think he's ready to accommodate a strong role for the United Kingdom in the shape of Sir Keir Starmer?
Well, I think the UK-France relationship has been turbocharged by the war in Ukraine and by now Trump and the unpredictability and turbulence of Trump. And the two are quite an interesting duo, actually, because Emmanuel Macron brings 8 years of experience. He's very good at these big international events. And Starmer brings political longevity, which Macron doesn't have. So Starmer's got the political stability at home, Macron's got the experience. They seem to be working extremely well together. And that is good because we are the two natural leaders of security in Europe, the two biggest military forces. It's good to see Britain back at the heart of European security. No, I don't think Macron has a problem with that. He does have a problem when it comes to defence industry cooperation, because he's quite keen to protect the French defence industry with these EU rules. And he's not very keen, I think, on seeing what we need to have, which is a much more open and effective European defence industry. That aside, I think it's working extremely well between the two countries.
Well, that's one bromance in the making. The other bromance would be, I guess, between the man in the White House and the man in the Kremlin. I think you're sceptical about President Trump's methods of diplomacy, but he's clearly had an effect. Do you think, first of all, that what is happening here is Putin is playing for time, or do you think actually something real is taking place?
Yeah, well, I agree with you that Trump has made this negotiation possible. I accept that. The kind of unpredictability and the brutality, the way he's approached it, has opened a space for negotiation. That's true. I do think Putin is playing for time, yes. First of all, I think he wants to try and push the Ukrainians out of that bit of Russia around Kursk, which the Ukrainians have been occupying. Secondly, I think he hates the idea of a short-term ceasefire with no strings attached, which he thinks would allow the Ukrainians to regroup and rearm. At the moment, the Russians are on the offensive, so it's not in his interest. So he's playing for time. He's avoiding saying no to Trump, but I think he's stringing it out.
I don't want to bring this too close back to home, but of course, one of the things that we always have to be worried about these days is that there are new methods of warfare, particularly cyber warfare. Do you think that we become more vulnerable because of the prominent role that Starmer's playing in all of this to Russian hackers and all of that?
Well, no, I think we've been vulnerable to that Russian sabotage and dark arts, as I call them, for years. We remember the poisoning of Mr. Litvinenko on the streets of London. We remember the Skripal poisoning. You know, we've seen what Russia is capable of for years and years. We've seen acts of sabotage, strange fires developing in arms factories overnight. So we have to be prepared for this. Yes, it is going to grow, but we are not alone in it, and I don't think what Keir Starmer is doing is putting it as particularly more at risk. I think all European countries have to be aware that as far as Putin is concerned, he's at war with us. Doesn't feel like that when you walk around in London, but that's what Putin thinks. So we have to be tough and vigilant, and we have to increase defence spending. There's absolutely no way around that.
In the end, Peter, if you had to lay a bet, what's the end game here, and what is the best pathway to the best possible outcome?
Well, the best conceivable outcome is that the war finishes with Ukraine clearly coming out of it as a country with its independence, with its right to decide its own future, with its right to move towards NATO, and Russia having clearly lost. Realistically, Ukraine's not going to drive Russia out of every inch of Ukrainian territory, but an outcome where Russia is seen to have failed in what it did, started 3 years ago. That would be the best outcome. I have to say there's quite a high likelihood that a ceasefire, even it can be achieved, won't last, and that for the next year or so we may well see the fighting continuing, unless and until the Russians...
A year?
Well, I mean, another fighting season, unless Trump is really prepared to double down on Putin and show him that there's no way that he can continue this grinding war, that he's prepared to arm Ukraine and support Ukraine. In the end, then, the factors that we were talking about, the weakness of the Russian economy, will come into play. But I don't see them pressuring Putin into a settlement soon. And unless Trump is prepared to do it, I fear this could drag on for some time yet. I hope not, but that's what I fear.
Peter Ricketts, Lord Ricketts, come back and talk to us about this in the future. Thank you very much indeed. Now, in just a moment, we'll hear once again from our panel.
Welcome to the world.
Our new podcast, starting now. It's very exciting. Every week, we'll be reporting from the world's trouble spots.
We get to hold those in positions of power accountable, and we get to ask the questions that the audience, the listeners, want to know about.
And that's why it is so important that people tune in, come along for the road, come along for the journey. It'll be fun.
Welcome back. This morning's terrific trio is back with us, and they're joshing amongst themselves. James Purnell, Joe Swinson, and Sir Ian Duncan Smith. Ian, Peter Ricketts was pretty sceptical about the idea of a peacekeeping force. Now, you've actually, as a military man, done this. What do you make of it?
Yeah, I did it in Rhodesia when we had to bring the Patriotic Front in and the war, etc. And the one thing I do remember about this, and having just come back from Ukraine about 2 or 3 weeks ago, I can see where we're sort of getting a bit carried away. So if I, like Peter Ricketts, pour a little bit of cold water over this, we had a tiny number, it was just over 1,000, something like that, troops there, some of them Commonwealth, a large chunk were from the UK. We were up against tens of thousands of ex-terrorists and fighters that we had to bring into assembly areas. In one assembly area, I remember, we had 50 Irish guardsmen, and there were 6,000 armed Patriotic Front who were in the camp voluntarily under the agreement.
That was Mr. Mugabe's
exactly. And there was nothing...
team.
And actually, the commander of the Irish group, who I knew very well and was very clever, he said, we had our rifles, and then one day I just realised within 2 days of being there, if they want to kill us, they're going to kill us. There's 50 of us here, there's nothing going to happen. So I got all my men to give me their arms and put them in a room, and I locked them up. And I said, you have to walk around without weapons to try and persuade them that you're not trying to attack them. And that sort of worked across the board, but that's kind of keeping the peace in a different way. What in Ukraine, when I came back, and I talked to them at length about this, the problem of all this, number one, a coalition of the willing made up of NATO nations is going to be rejected by Putin absolutely and will never accept it, because it then means he's right, he thinks, that NATO is trying to take over and give Ukraine their guarantee. The second bit of it is when I talked to a lot, and I saw the head of military intelligence while I was there, a man who's had 5 attempts on his life by the Russians, and other people, and they all basically came to the same conclusion. They said, our problem has been, you promised much, but you've never delivered what you promised. So the key weaponry that we're after that will allow us to defend and stop the Russians is what we're missing at the moment. He said, I have, for every artillery shell, 155mm artillery shell, Russia can fire 5 back at me. That is our problem, is that we just don't have enough. And he said, the guarantee for us is that you guarantee to give us this equipment at the level that you said you would and at the numbers. We will then do the rest, not a few thousand boots on the ground, which, even if Putin did agree to them, would act as no barrier whatsoever and could actually make it all worse. So their point was, we'll do it ourselves, but you need to give us your support.
Joe, I was quite surprised that Peter Ricketts saying could see this dragging on for another year. And maybe this is what Zelensky has said in the past, that he's getting enough support not to lose, but not enough to win and finish it.
Yeah, and I mean, it's obviously interesting to see how things have changed in the last 2 months and the different posture from the new American president. But as Lord Peter Ricketts was saying, the pressure is not there on Putin. So, the idea that this is going to reach some kind of ceasefire just doesn't at the moment feel very likely unless that pressure changes. And I think what we're all still trying to sort of get our heads around is the vastly different security situation, right? Like, European security is not sitting under some kind of American umbrella now. The leadership within the UK and indeed France and other countries in Europe needs to be much more positive and assertive, and that's why I think it is good to see Starmer and Macron with this alliance and taking that role. It's out of necessity rather than what we would have wanted in terms of our strong ally in the US historically, but that feels like that's going to be the new reality, and so it's absolutely essential.
What do you reckon, James? You you were there, for example, with Northern Ireland, peace talks and all of that, and your then colleague, Jonathan Powell, who played a pivotal role in the Good Friday Agreement and all of that, is now doing something similar here.
Yeah, so Jonathan was my boss in Number 10. And actually, I also worked with 2 gangs in Birmingham after politics to try and resolve a gang warfare that had been going on for years. And we went to see Jonathan. And actually, I think his approach would have been pretty similar to Northern Ireland and to that and to this, which is you've got to have a plan. You know, lots of people would have said about Northern Ireland that, you know, there was no solution that could be reached. The differences between Sinn Féin and the Unionists were sort of unbridgeable. But his view's always been build the relationships and then move it forward and then move it forward and keep moving it forward. And I think what he and obviously the Prime Minister, more importantly, have done in the last few weeks is get Europe back in the game, build momentum, and keep on moving it forward. I mean, you know, yesterday having Canada, New Zealand, Australia, maybe even Japan, even discussing the possibility of being part of some security guarantee in Europe is a pretty remarkable thing. You know, clearly, at the moment, they don't know what that endgame is going to be because we don't know what Trump's going to say, we don't know what Putin is going to say, and he will just be trying to keep on moving it forward. They're in a much better place than they were when the discussion was just between Russia and the US. They're in a much better place than after the Zelensky bust-up at the White House, and they will try and keep on moving it forward.
All right. This is all about leadership. We're going to talk about that after the break. It's not often that you have more than one former party leader around the same desk, so why don't we talk about that issue, the tricky art of leadership? We're back with our panel after this break.
In the last 5 years, more than 13,000 farmers have left agriculture in the UK.
Is it going to be viable for the future?
No farmers, no food!
The frustration, the anger, the fact that so many of them are at risk of going bust has now become too much.
You've got to keep hope because one day it's going to be okay.
I'm Dan Whitehead, Sky News' West of England and Wales correspondent.
It's scary what's happening in the country.
It's the illegal migrants that we don't want here.
How difficult is this to police tonight? Off the scale. Having the police speak to us so starkly right in the middle of the riot showed just how serious the situation was. The water on board the barge contaminated with Legionella bacteria, an outbreak that was first revealed by Sky News. There have been questions for months over whether the support offered to asylum seekers on the bivvy is sufficient.
A cruel place to put human beings.
From busy cities to rural communities, we spend every day reporting on how big decisions impact real people. The last smoke and steam rises into the sky above Blast Furnace 4.
Today is a day in history. Ever told that?
The closure means more than 2,000 job losses.
It just seems madness. It is a highly contagious infection. South West Water did apologise again.
This is the Revenge Porn Helpline.
They're helping terrified victims.
You've been a victim of a very common type of online crime known as sextortion.
We're making things better for people.
Stonehenge became the latest victim of Just Stop Oil.
Now I can say I've been to the orange Stonehenge.
Sky News, get the full story first, free, wherever you get your news.
In February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. Thousands of Russians were drafted. For some, the reality of frontline warfare meant one thing: desertion.
I had a rush of adrenaline. It was a kind of treason.
But they did not escape on their own.
I help people to desert Russian army.
The stakes are high, but for some, there's no other option.
We keep going till Putin's regime is over.
Escaping Putin on Sky News.
Sky News, get the full story first.
Is this now all your territory?
Yeah. The battlefield is outside the barricades. We are in the middle of a forest, in a jungle really, and they're attempting to keep these men alive. I'm Stuart Ramsey, and I'm Sky's chief correspondent.
It's really dangerous. Many people have died riding it.
We are under Israeli military restrictions in terms of some of the things that we can film, but it's important to be in there. What a slow drive for the president as he approaches his golf club.
4 more years!
Free wherever you get your news. I'm Mark Stone and I'm Sky's correspondent based here in Washington, D.C.
Welcome back. James Purnell, Joe Swinson and Ian Duncan Smith are still with us. Now, I said you two are party leaders. There are many people, James, who thought that you should have been a party leader. One of the underlying stories of the last week or two has been the emergence of what people might think of as a different Keir Starmer, more confident and bestriding the international stage and so on. Do people become leaders in this way, Ian?
Leadership in politics is different from leadership in the military or even in business, I think, because everything is played out on the public arena. And the other thing is that you lead other politicians behind you are together because of a general sense that they agree with the direction of where you are, which is why they're Conservative or Labour or Liberal Democrats, or what it happens to be, but pretty much differ on just about everything else while you're at it. And I always remember Churchill's great phrase when there was some new boy in the chamber and he's recorded as the man saying, "It's wonderful, isn't it? Over there, you know, are the enemy, and over here as the government." And he said, "You've got this completely wrong." He said, "Over there is the opposition. All around you are the enemy." And the point he makes is that before very length of time, there's always going to be people start sniping and then sniping away publicly, and so it goes on, and disagree with you because of this and that, and then suddenly things aren't working out exactly as you'd thought, and then in they come. It's particularly the case when you're opposition, but certainly in government it takes a little bit of time and that happens. So it's a peculiar kind of leadership because you're cajoling, you're having to promise. In government, of course, you promise all sorts of things.
And lots of other people who want the job.
And everybody thinks they can do your job from start to finish, and that's the key. But with opposition, you have none of those things you can offer. You can't offer knighthoods, you can't offer patronage or the House of Lords. But in government, at least you can wean one or two of them.
Joe, you must have had a jolly time as leader.
Well, I mean, it was certainly quite an exciting time. 2019 in British politics was like some people have said, it was like politics on dog years. It was very, very fast moving.
Yeah, I'm just being reminded you led the polls at one point.
Well, I mean, there was a lot of different stages in that time. But I think what's interesting is that, of course, you're also very much responding to events, right? And so many politicians, we kind of think of them as a leader, and that's what the particular view was. But that's often been shaped by what happened. So, I mean, Thatcher, she was a very different leader after the Falklands War than before it. Even Blair, I mean, if you remember, we sort of think of them as this international statesman. If you remember Spitting Image in the 1990s, when he first became leader, he was portrayed as the schoolboy. So,
Bambi, I think,
very, very different kind of view after he'd been in post for some time. And so people's kind of legacies almost get defined. And then, of course, for many people, Blair will be associated with the Iraq War decisions. So I think that the events that happen and that shape, and obviously, in my time as leader, the very many events on Brexit were absolutely what needed to be kind of responded to. And from a Lib Dem position, we had unity within our party on that issue, but it was clearly a very fraught time in British politics generally.
It may be rude of me or impertinent, I suppose. Are we seeing a leader being made by events in Starmer rather than intrinsically?
I think Joe's right. Prime Ministers are often sort of born from events. You think of Bush, George W. Bush, and 9/11, Churchill, most obviously. I think Keir Starmer and this Labour government's character is emerging in response to events, and that's kind of understandable. But there's some continuity there as well. You've now got a sort of fairly ruthless decisiveness, which is justified by the events. I think some bold decisions around public spending. Feels like now a pretty clear focus on the kind of hero voters, as they name them, sort of core working class families who they think won them the last election. So I think both sort of ideologically, but also in terms of the kind of character of Keir Starmer and the government, you have something which, because of the events, has sort of propelled them, brought those sort of character traits that they had before to the fore. I think one other thing that's happened is, interestingly, there was a bit of a debate before Christmas about should Keir Starmer really embrace the fact that he was doing more on foreign policy and that should be sort of the core offer as opposed to domestic issues like the cost of living. Actually, because of what's happening with geopolitics, those two are now the same. So actually, prosperity through security is actually not just a sort of political message, it's what's necessary. If you have, a disaster in Ukraine, that's not going to be good for prosperity. So what was a bit of a sort of conversation between political consultants has now actually become what the government needs to do.
Indeed. And in fact, all of that is producing an economic situation which is quite seriously problematic for Rachel Reeves, who in, 10 days, has to come forward with her public spending. Let's have a look at the thing that she is having to deal with.
We're not going to be able to turn everything around in 1 month. We're turning this economy around. Already we've brought stability back to the economy.
Am I satisfied with the numbers published today? Of course not. And we hope that those numbers will start to improve because of the policies that we're pursuing in the months ahead. Today's numbers just strengthen my resolve that we need to go further and faster. I am determined to go further and faster in delivering the economic growth, and we need to go further and faster in growing our economy.
I love the way that in politics, a phrase emerges and you just get hammered with it, Joe. Growth is flat. That's their big problem, isn't it, really?
I mean, it certainly makes the job harder. But I think the idea that there's some kind of magic quick win that is going to deliver it just also feels like a fallacy. And I'm fearful that the response is going to be a sort of return to austerity, which didn't work in the coalition government 2010 to 2015 and isn't, in my view, the right prescription now, because the foundations of a prosperous economy are people in good health and good skills. They're about having that security internationally. And so, I look at what we're doing to say we're going to increase defence spending. So we look at cutting the aid budget, including, it now seems, potentially cuts to the World Service, which is one of the best projections of soft power and influence in an uncertain world and would be a strategically illiterate thing to do. And then you compare with someone like Germany, which under a new Conservative leader is saying that the response to need additional defence spending should be met by actually a more expansive view to fiscal space. So perhaps
when you say that, you mean more borrowing, is what Friedrich Merz is doing.
I mean, I think there's a conversation to be had here, frankly, about when you have unprecedented threats, right? When you have a security situation, it is no good for the global financial markets if you have huge conflict and an uncertainty within economies. And so that security is something which is, yes, good for the country, and it's good for others that might be lending money too.
Ian, you used to be a dry, didn't you, as I remember it?
Yeah, that's an old phrase. I haven't heard that for
no borrowing, fiscal discipline, all of that?
Well, I think governments do need fiscal discipline. I mean, the history of the world is littered with governments that thought you could just chuck money at everything and then eventually decide they have to claw in harder. So I have some sympathy, of course, with any government that realises that they've got a problem. I think the old medical term, I think, is the one that I would say to her is, whatever else you do, do none harm. And the problem, I think, is in her first budget, she made some assumptions about how the economy would grow. And events have this terrible habit of knocking that off completely. So we talked earlier on about the problems if you start to raise the threshold for paying national insurance. Who does that affect? That affects people stepping into work. So that makes small businesses unlikely to hire part-time work or extra workers because the cost is too great. And once that stops, then what happens is the money doesn't go into the economy and then the economy gets hit at the same time. So if I was advising anything to her, I would say you need to have a review, even if it's only short-term review. The second thing is, yep, you can always step back into borrowing, but the trouble with borrowing is somebody still has to pay for it, and that's where your problem comes from.
You've got 10 seconds. What's she got to do?
Sorry.
We're a third poorer than we were before the financial crisis. We now have to take really strategic measures. That's what they're looking at around planning, around what they're looking at on defence. We are much more constrained in terms of borrowing than we were in 2007, so there's less room for manoeuvre.
Well, I hope Chantal's watching. That's it for this week's show. I'll be back next Sunday, and we'll be here at 08:30. Watch Sophie every weekday at 7 o'clock here on Sky News. Bye-bye. We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story. I'm ready. Are you? Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
Good morning, this is Sky News Today. I'm Matt Barbett. It's 10 o'clock. The top stories, breaking news. At least 51 people have been killed and more than 100 injured in a nightclub fire in North Macedonia. It's thought that more than 1,000 people were inside the club when the fire broke out during a concert in the early hours by a local group. We will have the latest. Also this morning, the Health Secretary refuses to be drawn on reports the government's considering a U-turn on plans to cut welfare benefits. But he says the current system cannot continue.
Are people being signed off too easily these days?
Well, the system is definitely unsustainable if it carries on growing at this rate.
34 people are now known to have died in severe storms which have been sweeping across the United States. The former prisoners who still fear being recalled to prison despite having served their minimum sentence. A capsule docks at the International Space Station, enabling 2 stranded astronauts to start planning their journey back to Earth. And West End nostalgia, the cult movies that are winning over new fans on the London stage. Good morning. We start this hour with breaking news. At least 51 people have died after a fire broke out at a nightclub in North Macedonia. It happened in the eastern town of Kočani, 60 miles from the capital Skopje. Around 1,500 people are thought to have been attending a concert at the Pulse nightclub. The country's interior minister said young clubbers were using pyrotechnics inside, maybe fireworks, causing the roof to catch fire. Let's bring in Sky's Alice Porter. A devastating situation. Alice, tell us what else you know so far.
Yeah, this is a major fire and a major tragedy that's happened in North Macedonia. What we know is it happened at around 2:35 local time when a lot of young partygoers were watching a concert. They'd come together to watch this concert on a busy Saturday night. Now, we understand from the country's interior minister that pyrotechnics were used. Now, these are controlled fireworks, flames or smoke, and they're used to create special visual effects. They can be popular at things like concerts, but what we know is something went wrong and sparks caused the roof of the nightclub to catch fire. Now, there's been lots of videos showing total chaos inside the nightclub with young people running through the smoke. The musicians on stage were urging people to escape as quickly as possible, but sadly we know that 51 people so far have lost their lives. Now, family members have gathered in front of hospitals and Kočani's city offices, begging authorities for more information. This happened very much in the middle of the night, so we're still starting to get more of a picture as to what actually happened. Now, we know that 118 people have been injured and they've been taken to hospital, including to Skopje City Hospital. That's in the country's capital, which is about 60 miles away. Many of them are being treated with severe burns, no doubt also smoke inhalation as well. Now, we know that police have arrested one man, but they haven't provided details on the person involved. But questions are certainly going to be asked now as to how this fire could have started that has sadly claimed the lives of 51 people so far and injured more than 100. This is a significant fire. Well, we've got a statement from North Macedonia's Prime Minister, the Hitcian Mikoski. He says, "It is with deep sadness that I've received the news of the terrible tragedy in Kočani. This is a difficult and very sad day for Macedonia. The loss of so many young lives is irreparable, and the pain of the families, loved ones and friends is immeasurable. The people and the government will do everything in their power to at least alleviate their pain a little and help them in these most difficult moments. The government is fully mobilised and will do everything